So let's look first at mark number 7. A secular Christian commits spiritual adultery. Please look with me at the first part of verse 14. Peter describes these false teachers by saying they have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. Now, this particular Greek word for adultery is used 6 times in the New Testament, and only 1 time does it refer to the physical act of a spouse violating the marriage bed. Every other usage in the New Testament refers to spiritual adultery. And spiritual adultery is a massive theme in Scripture. What is spiritual adultery? Well, spiritual adultery is when a person professes to be a Christian, says he belongs to Christ, but finds his real enjoyment, his real love, his real pleasure in other things. So it's adultery because he says, I'm married to Christ, but he violates that relationship on the most basic, fundamental level. Jesus is not the God of his heart. And this is the story of the Old Testament. Before the children of Israel even entered the promised land, God predicted that they would turn away in spiritual prostitution. Deuteronomy 31:16, this is the Lord speaking. He says, this people will rise and they will whore after the foreign gods among them in the land that they were entering. And this is most vividly on display in the book of Hosea. It's a short, minor prophet. God commanded the prophet Hosea to marry a prostitute at the very beginning of this story in order to make a parable. Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, he says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. The whole book of Hosea is a parable of how Israel committed spiritual adultery against the Lord. And in the New Testament, the same language is used. Jesus called the crowds in Matthew 12:39, he calls them, "O adulterous generation." And it wasn't just gross sinners who were in the crowd. It was very religious people that he was also calling adulterous. James, in James 4:4, a letter specifically written to the church, he says, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? So in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have this language of spiritual adultery. So let's just consider for a moment what adultery presupposes. What does adultery presuppose? What presupposes the existence of a marriage? It presupposes intimacy and friendship and exclusive relationship. In fact, out of all the ways in which our relationship with Christ is described in the Bible, marriage is the most intimate. The church is called the sheepfold, and Christ is our shepherd, John 10. We are called a spiritual house, and Christ is the chief cornerstone, 1 Peter 2. We are the branches, Jesus is the vine, John 15. But the most wonderful relationship, the climax of all of the descriptions of our relationship to Christ is that of marriage, that he is our bridegroom and that we are his bride. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 2, I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. And when we hear these descriptions, one of the questions that we should ask is, why would God want us to think about our relationship with Jesus as a bride and a bridegroom? Because he wants us to see that he truly loves us more than a husband loves his wife. He picked the most magnificent human relationship, and he says that's what your relationship is with me. Marriage was invented so that we could have an inkling of an idea of the kind of relationship that Christ desires with his people. And when Peter describes secular Christians here in verse 14, when he says that they have eyes full of adultery, he's saying that they betray this most intimate relationship that they claim to have. Peter is, it would be such a superficial read if we read this verse to say Peter is just talking about people that are sleeping around. That's not what he is restricting these words to. It's more than that. A secular Christian is anyone who says that they belong to Jesus, but then give their hearts to other things. In other words, you can be the most moral, professing Christian on the planet and still be guilty of spiritual authority, or spiritual adultery. Consider just an illustration of this from marriage. What is the essence of marriage? It's an exclusive one-flesh relationship between a man and a wife. The husband and the wife are joined together at every single level. They're joined together socially, familially, financially, locationally, emotionally, physically. But imagine for a moment a husband who is socially ashamed of his wife. When they go out in public, he doesn't want to be near her. He doesn't want to identify with her. He doesn't want to be seen talking to her. He wants no visible connection to her when they're together socially. But in the bedroom, he's completely moral. He doesn't violate the marriage bed. He's moral when it comes to adultery. Is he being a faithful husband? No, not at all. What is he depriving her of? Relationship. The very thing that marriage was intended to bring. The very meaning of relationship. He doesn't want her. Now I bring this example up to demonstrate a very important principle. When Peter says that these secular Christians have eyes full of adultery, he is including moral people and immoral people. This was the same in Jesus' day. Do you remember the two groups of people in Jesus' day? The Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees were the liberals. They denied the basic fundamental biblical truths like the resurrection. They were the blue staters. But then on the other hand, the Pharisees, they weren't the liberals, they were the conservatives. They held to the historicity and the inerrancy of the Bible. But they were legalists because they added more to the Bible than what God said. They were the red staters. So on one hand, the Pharisees and the Sadducees couldn't be more different than they were outwardly. But Jesus said to both groups, you adulterous generation. Sadducees used their loose living to commit spiritual adultery. The Pharisees used their legal living to commit spiritual adultery. Both groups identified with Jesus in name only, or they identified with God in name only, but they didn't want anything to do with him in their hearts.